Hi everyone, welcome back. I have been getting a lot of emails from people asking me all kinds of questions that I am not really qualified to answer. So I want to begin this video by just pointing it to a few people who might be better equipped to answer your questions than I am. The first person is Dr. Megan Jones. You'll see her contact details right under mine. And her email address is meganj@sun.ac.za. She's the person who is responsible overall for the English 178 course. And the online assistant, if you have issues with tutorials, completing tutorials, not seeing your mark, those kinds of technical things, Jared is really responsible for managing the online technologies, and he should be able to help you. You'll see his email address is 182113321@sun.ac.za. I can really answer questions about the lecture content, and not so much about all these other aspects of the course. All right, now that we have that out of the way, in the previous video I talked to you about Muhammad Ali's aphorism, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and I was discussing how close analysis involves looking for patterns of form and content in a poem, or any literary text for that matter. What distinguishes literary writing is that it invites a form of reading that is attentive to patterns. You know, a long time ago, Nando's, the chicken franchise, advertised its peri peri chicken with the slogan, "Grills like a butterfly, stings like a bee." And what they meant was obviously that the chicken looks like a butterfly, right? It's a butterfly cut chicken, and the peri peri sauce is perny, so it stings. And we'd look kind of stupid if we tried to analyze the Nando's advertisement in the same way as Ali's original aphorism. I don't think Nando's wants us to think of their chicken as graceful, ethereal, transient, colorful, beautiful, fragile, all those other things that we were talking about. All they're referring to in the advertisement is the shape of the chicken. And the same with the bee, right? The list becomes a lot shorter. They refer only to pain, not to the smallness of the bee, not to nature, not to being busy, not to vulnerability. It's peri peri chicken, so it burns your mouth. So, interestingly, even though Nando's is using pretty much the same words as Muhammad Ali, a few substitutions here and there, the context of the advertisement compels us to read it very differently. The metaphoric range becomes considerably more impoverished. So I'm just throwing that out there to yet again underscore the importance of context in any reading that we're doing. Incidentally, I'm sure some of you are starting to consider the possibility that we're over-analyzing Muhammad Ali, and maybe in general in English courses that we over-analyze things. You know, we're bringing all these apparently extraneous stuff about butterflies and bees to something that's really straightforward. Ali wasn't sitting around thinking, how can I convey a sense of grace and vulnerability and complementary and interdependent contrasts in my fighting technique. You know, he just said it. And now we're sitting here counting angels on the head of a pin. My answer after many years of thinking and reading about this topic is that there is in fact such a thing as overreading a text. You can go too far. But I do not think that we are overreading Ali's aphorism in our attempt to understand its effect. believe it or not, when you hear the word butterfly, you do actually think about all the associations you have with a butterfly. I could probably prove it to you on an MRI scan of your brain. In fact, just to counter allegations that we're unscientific in the humanities, I can point you to a groundbreaking study which was published in 2013 by someone called Adam Zeeman, a professor of cognitive and behavioral neurology at the University of Exeter Medical School. And it's called By Heart, an fMRI study of brain activation by poetry in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. You know, your brain neurons are designed to make complex connections. When someone says rain to you, a whole range of responses from semantic to emotional light up in your brain. But these associations stay beneath the threshold of consciousness, right? Because it would be impossible to understand what anyone is saying if we didn't limit and simplify things. And literary studies is fundamentally, it's about not making that simplification, not simplifying things, but to dig beneath the surface of consciousness to give words to a process of association that normally happens beyond your conscious awareness. Or, you know, to put it really simply, it's about articulating in some way what we already know. But before I digress too much, let me foreground three observations I would like to make that are relevant to studying literary texts. The first point I think we covered in our previous lecture. Analyzing a literary text involves identifying significant patterns. Text can be analyzed by looking for patterns. That's what we were doing with Muhammad Ali. The second point, I guess, is really self-evident, but it's just a reminder. I mean, until we encounter a literate alien species, texts are made by humans. They're human artifacts, and they are human artifacts that make meaning. A picture of a tree is a text. A tree itself is not a text. The moment we make a picture of a tree, we bring it into the world of symbolic meaning. We employ textual conventions that mediate and influence the way in which we understand the tree. The tree is no longer just a tree, in other words. The final point is something I'll be talking about a lot more as we go on, and I guess it's a new point. Texts have a reciprocal relation to the world. What do I mean by this? Well, we often think of textual representation like language as a description of a world that exists out there. To a certain extent, that's what language is. It provides us with the ability to construct a picture of the world, the already existing world. This is in fact what Aristotle meant back in classical antiquity when he wrote his book Poetics, that art has a mimetic function. It copies reality. And this ability we have to make copies of the world gives us, as humans, an enormous advantage in terms of natural selection and evolution, right? It means a mother can say to a child, don't stick your finger in the electric socket. We don't have to learn only by example. We can learn through copies of the world that do not affect us directly. So we don't have to electrocute ourselves in order to learn that lesson. We can learn it through language, because language has this ability to construct a copy, to construct a model of the world. But, and this is something we're really interested in literary studies, texts don't just copy the world. They also create the world that we see. Words and pictures are not just descriptive, they're also prescriptive. In some ways, we could think of art and creative writing as one of the privileged spaces where new ways of seeing and understanding reality are born. Artists are almost like engineers of reality who build new metaphors and possibilities of understanding. Let me give you a very silly example. All right, silly example. I can show you this, and you might agree with me that it's a book, right? And I can show you this, and you might agree with me that it's a cup. You see the cup and the book? Now I'm going to do this, and I will ask you, what do you see now? And you might say, well, I see a cup on a book, right? But what if I tell you that, in fact, what you're looking at here is a skibitnik? It's not a cup on a book. It's, in other words, I've just invented it. This thing is called a skibitnik. I promise you, if you grew up with skibitniks, if your mother talked about why your skibitnik looks better than the neighbors, if they told you, please be careful, don't break your sister's skibitnik, if you were asked to bring a skibitnik to school with you on the first day, there would be no doubt in your mind that what I've just done is to assemble a little skibitnik in order to show you. You would know what a skibitnik is because you'd be habituated through language use to think of this thing as a skibitnik. And now, do you see the broken skibitnik? So just 30 seconds ago you'd have seen a coffee cup in a book, but now you see a broken skibitnik. Do you follow what I'm saying here? I mean, it's a silly example, but language does have this capacity not just to describe what's going on out there, but in fact to make what we see, to mediate reality in a particular way, to assemble things according to particular conventions of understanding. And you could say that the same thing applies to words like patriotism or democracy or maybe even love. That these concepts are in fact all skibitniks. They look as if they describe something that's already there, in other words, but in fact the word itself, love, patriotism, skibitnik, is in turn embedded in all kinds of cultural understandings and to a certain extent produce the object that they seem to describe, if you follow what I'm saying. And it's this capacity of language to create, to manufacture reality that really fascinates us in literary studies. Now that we've covered these 3 points, texts can be read by looking for patterns, texts are human artifacts, and texts enjoy a reciprocal relation to the world, I want to give you a small demonstration of how we can acquire a critical vocabulary and then apply to the analysis of a text. And I've decided for these lectures to introduce you to a small toolbox of terms that I think is useful for studying visual heavy text like advertisements. So I'm going to be looking specifically at advertisements with you. Now the point is not that I want you to remember these terms forever and ever. They're not that important, right? Anchoring, framing, modality. Here are some more actors, carriers, vectors, the given new axis, the ideal real axis. I don't think they're really important, but I just want to give you a sense of how a critical vocabulary can help us to identify certain patterns. Each term here refers to a kind of pattern, and it helps us to identify it and to talk about it when we make an analysis of a text. What's important here, in other words, is the process, okay, not so much the content. What I really want to bring across is that any kind of literary analysis involves acquiring a critical vocabulary and I'm almost modeling the process for you here with this small self-contained critical vocabulary. That the critical vocabulary is not an end in itself, but a kind of shorthand that we use to identify significant patterns, and that analysis then consists of saying something about the text that we discover when we use this critical vocabulary. So it's also not an end in itself to identify examples of modality or framing or whatever in a text. Once you've identified examples of these things, particular patterns, you have to be able to say something about it in a critical analysis. I'm going to start with the first concept, which is the idea of the sign, which comes from a sub-branch of linguistics called semiotics. And Ferdinand de Saussure was a linguist who in 1916 published a book called A Course in General Linguistics. In fact, his students published it for him. He never published anything himself. And he came up with what was at the time quite a revolutionary way of thinking about things like words. He said a sign is anything that we decide stands for something other than itself. Signs generate meaning in a semiotic system. So if you think of a sign as a word, the word tree is not a tree. It's just a sound coming out of my mouth or a particular arrangement of scratches on a piece of paper. But the word tree stands for something else. A real tree. We can talk about real trees without there being any real trees in the room. And he said that a sign consists of two things, a signifier and a signified, and that these two things are linked entirely by social convention. So there's no necessary link between them. Here you see Saussure giving us an example of someone saying tree or someone writing tree. I mean, I could tell you that from now on, if I clap my hands like this, I mean tree. Right? After a while, you'd get used to it. I'd say, all right, everyone, let's go outside and meet me by the... And you'd know I mean tree. That's what Saussure means when he says it's entirely a matter of social convention. There's no necessary connection between the signifier and the signified. So the material thing that we use to represent tree, whether we're clapping our hands or saying boom or saying tree or writing the word tree, is the signifier. And the signified is not the actual tree, right? The signified is what you think of, the mental image, the psychological image that you have when I use the word tree. So you can have a sign without the actual referent, the real tree, being present at all. What you have is you have the signifier, particular sounds, and you have a kind of mental picture that's evoked. So it's simple when we're talking about tables or trees or whatever. But again, when we talk about something like patriotism or love, the word comes out of my mouth, and the idea that it evokes, I would guess, would be very different for each of you individually. You might not have the same kind of idea of what patriotism is, even though we use the same word for it. So there, the relationship between the signifier and the signified, you could say, is a little bit more fluid, a little bit more individual, and in this case, the relationship is quite straightforward. It would be complicated with the Shkibitnik, because by now, if I say Shkibitnik, you're going to imagine a coffee cup on a book, right? It doesn't mean that a coffee cup on a book is a thing. The thing, the signified, is created by the signifier. That's what makes it a little bit more complicated. But that's just the basic distinction. All right, the one thing represents something else, a sound, marks on a piece of paper, whatever you want, and the thing that it represents, the signified, is the idea that you have of that thing, and it might be a little bit different to whatever idea the person next to you has of the same thing. Now, as human beings, we are almost like fish swimming in a sea of signs. They are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. They surround us. To a certain extent, our survival depends on our ability to read the signs. Literally with road signs, here's a random picture of a street corner, and I just try to pick out all the different signs here. The red ones are the ones I think are really important to your survival, and the green ones are, you know, just signs that are present in the landscape. So, you know, you have to understand what the road markings mean. That's a very important kind of sign. You have to know what the solid barrier line is, where you can't overtake, where you have to stop. You've got the traffic light, which is obviously a very important sign. One of the first signs that you learn when you're in primary school. Red means stop and green means go. You've got a sign telling you where you're going and what road you're on. I think that's pretty important, especially in some parts of South Africa. Then you've got less important signs, you know, the number plate of the other cars. I always look at that. I'm interested to see where people come from, and I judge how they drive based on what their number is. You've got the poster for a political party, all these different signs kind of competing for your attention. And really it never stops. From the moment we wake up until we go to sleep, as human beings, we live in a world of science, and we are engaging with the signs around us. Now, one thing that we can say about the signs that we find in modern publications, the kinds of magazines and websites and so on that we visit, is that they are multimodal. There's another vocabulary item for you. Multimodal simply means that we're very used to seeing different kinds of signs mixed together: streaming video, audio, pictures, writing. So this is a typical tabloid newspaper, Ancient Indian Prophecies to Survive 2012. Remember, the world was supposed to end in 2012. My sister has this theory that in fact the world did end in 2012, and it's just been kind of slow in its disintegration, which I started to think might be true. And there you go, NASA telescope finds heaven. So in case you were wondering if heaven exists, well, NASA found it. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked here. But the point I want to make is that you know, contemporary publications are very multimodal. We mix different kinds of semiotic systems, different kinds of science systems together. Whereas if you go back, here's the Kilo Daily Tribune from Hawaii, 1922. You'll see that it's not so multimodal. In fact, it's almost monomodal in the sense that you really only have writing. This seems very foreign, right, to us as a modern audience. We'd be surprised if we saw a newspaper like this. So our world is increasingly multimodal. So that's another word for you, multimodal. Now I could ask you, why, to make this point, did I put the earlier newspaper on the left and the more recent publication on the right? Why did I not explain my point like this? Do you see, this looks a bit wrong. If I'm talking about in the past, things didn't used to be so multimodal and now they're much more multimodal, there'd be something confusing about it. And it's really just this convention, which we call the given new or the then now axis. And all it means is that as people who belong to a culture that reads from left to right, we tend to put things that happened earlier on the left and things that happened later on the right. We don't even think about it anymore. It's just a aspect of our culture that we are immersed in, that we take for granted, that's become completely naturalized. And it's just a convention. There's no reason it has to be like this. You know, there's no biological reason why what happened earlier should be on the left and what happened later should be on the right. So it's a way of organizing signs in order to create meaning that we've acquired through convention. You probably can't even remember when you first learned that the thing on the left means it came earlier. It means that we can understand this bad little joke that they're trying to make here. You know, if you were an Afghan peasant from the 13th century, you'd have no idea what's going on here. It would look to you as if someone just put a whole bunch of animals and humans together in a picture, and they all seem to be standing behind this guy on the computer who's doing something on a desk. But because we've been inducted in this way of understanding the then now axis, we know that what they're saying is, oh look, you know, we started off as primates and then slowly we learned to walk upright, and now we're kind of devolving again so that we look like primates again. The thing that I find interesting about this joke is actually not what they're saying about evolution, but the fact that in these pictures about evolution, it's always a man. Have you noticed? You almost never see a picture of a woman when they're illustrating the process of evolution. I mean, why is that? Half of the human race consists of women, but for some reason it's always men. Now, there's, you know, something more interesting that you can say actually about the choices informing the way these signs are chosen. And it's almost always a white man. I don't know if you've noticed that. Whenever you see an illustration of evolution, it's a white guy for some reason who is the pinnacle of evolution. So yeah, it's not something that people even really think about unless they're trained in critical analysis. It's just that the sort of standard representative of a human being tends to be a white male, and that reveals all kinds of assumptions and cultural prejudices. So, you know, this is also, it's part of what critical reading means. We identify the axis, we see how it works here, but there are also interesting things to do with culture, with context, with bias, with framing, and so on that we can pull out here. We all understand, you know, that this is supposed to be a joke because we know the convention of before and after pictures. You're supposed to have the flabby guy on the left, you know, before he embarks on his workout program or takes his supplements or whatever, and then the good-looking guy is supposed to be on the right. So simply by switching these two pictures around, they've made a little joke about Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it's a joke that would not be intelligible, that would not make any sense to you if you didn't understand the left-right convention. It's a kind of literacy, in other words, that we acquire at some point. A way of understanding how picture texts are constructed. I'm going to end my lecture there, and maybe just to remind you, I think there's already something about this on Sunlearn, just to remind you when we're looking at pictures especially that, as Magritte says, a pipe is not a pipe. He has a picture of a pipe, it's captioned, "This is not a pipe," and you understand that it's not a pipe because it's a representation of a pipe. And because it's a picture of a pipe, it's framed in a particular way, it's painted by someone, for someone in a particular context, and it's made to bear meaning. It's not a mere mute object. It's an object that's made to speak. And what we're interested in as we continue now with looking at these visual examples and advertisements is how are these images made to speak? What are they made to say? What do they include and what do they leave out? What are the assumptions that inform the way in which they create meaning?